Okay, everyone, welcome. This is a new lesson. It's called Changes in an Ecosystem. All last week and the week before that, we were talking about competition and predation, different types of relationships within an ecosystem. And we finished off last week talking about, okay, what are the results of competition or cooperation? We talked about extinction, population control. We talked about character displacement. We also talked about niche specialization. All four of those are the main consequences um, of competition and cooperation in a community. So um, this week we're going to kind of dive into okay, well, when organisms are living and existing together, we want to know which organisms are key in keeping everything running. So our goal for today is that students will be able to explain how a ketone species provides structure and stability in an ecosystem. Okay, and just hint, hint, ketone species is an important key term here. And again, the whole idea is saying we understand now that there's competition, organisms have different relationships, but which organisms are key in maintaining the structure of that ecosystem? Do ecosystems fall apart if you get rid of certain organisms as well? Okay. And then the second part of this week will be that students will be able to explain how predator-prey relationships shape communities. So we will have an article that we'll be looking at about wolf populations in Yellowstone, which is a place. Yellowstone National Park is just 3 hours from where we live. So kind of cool that it's the case study that we're going to be learning about um, is close to home. Okay. Also, not that you need to do the ecology quiz right now, but on Monday there was a quiz posted. You needed to have finished that. So please do so before coming to class this week. Okay. So we're going to start with our notes. Again, the title is Change in an Ecosystem. This is Unit 1, Week 3, Day 2, 1 through 2. Again, you can ignore this down here. All you need to know is this is still in Unit 1, which is ecology, and we're specifically talking about changes within an ecosystem. What happens when you remove or add new organisms? Okay. So, food chains. You've probably heard a little bit about a food chain, but just as a little bit of an introduction, I want to talk about what I ate for lunch today. You could do this with your own food. We'll probably do an example of this in class when we get together this week. But I'm going to trace my food back to its origins, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation about it. So I ate for lunch today, I ate some shrimp. Okay. And I don't know if you can see that. Let's make it bigger. I ate some shrimp. And if you don't know what shrimp eat, I did a little bit of research on my own for you guys. If we were normally in class, I'd have you, kind of research it along with me. But here we are. Okay, so shrimp actually eat plankton. They eat the carcasses of dead fish. They don't necessarily kill the fish, but they eat the carcasses. They also, can catch small fish. This is rare. It has to be a very, very small fish in order for that to work. But the one that we're going to focus on today is plankton because plankton are a living thing. If you've ever seen SpongeBob, plankton is one of my favorite characters. But plankton exist and they're super, super small little organisms that shrimp eat on. Now, so let's just get a list going. So shrimp eat plankton. Cool. Now, what do plankton eat? Well, it's actually in the same picture. Plankton eat this algae, and specifically, plankton eat Oh my goodness, I'm choking on my words. Plankton, or the specific type of plankton that shrimp eat, are called zooplankton. Kind of a silly word, but just meaning small animal. Okay, and then we have zooplankton eating this algae, but there's a specific type of name for this microalgae. It's called phytoplankton. Okay, so I ate shrimp today. Okay, so Miss G eats shrimp. The shrimp, oops, all right, I guess we're shrimp. The shrimp eats zooplankton, and zooplankton eat phytoplankton. Bam. Okay. So I've kind of created a list going back to the plant, because phytoplankton, which is a type of algae, is a plant. And what do plants get their nutrients from? Well, since you're not here to answer me that, hopefully you said sunlight, water, and the nutrients in the water. Again, if we're talking about in the ocean or in a lake, where you would find the shrimp, right? The shrimp are eating on the zooplankton. The zooplankton are eating on this algae, which is called phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is getting its nutrients, or able to make its own nutrients, using sunlight. Okay, so the whole point of this was we're going to make a food chain. So, talking about this from Miss G, I'm kind of the last one in this food chain, but I want to be able to write a food chain in a way that's going to make sense. It doesn't look sloppy like this. I want to make sure that I can trace back where my food comes from, all the way back to sunlight. So, the point of making a food chain is to trace back your food all the way back to the very origin of sunlight. So, if I was going to do that, I could come over here, um, and make it in this format. This is the way that I expect you guys to make food chains from now on, always starting with the sun. Okay, so let's make a note here after I go over what is a food chain. So, food chains are a series of organisms. That just means a list of living things that are each dependent on each other as a food source. Okay, so this would be Miss G. I was eating the shrimp. The shrimp eat the shrimp eat the phytoplankton, or the zooplankton, and the zooplankton eat the um, phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton gets their nutrients from the sun. So it could be a long food chain, or it could be a short food chain. So let's take what I ate for lunch and let's make it into this format, right? The sun goes to the plant, goes to the first living organism that eats plants, and then the second. I'm trying not to use the vocabulary yet, just because we're on a very basic level, but I will I'll get there. I'm just struggling a little bit. Okay, so we start off with the sun again. Sun. Always start a food chain with the sun. And then we have the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton. Plankton. And we're going to make that a little bit bigger. Let's make the zooplankton. And then we can do the shrimp that Miss G ate. And then Miss G. There we go. Took a little while, but there we go. Okay, so again, just like in our main example, we have the sun, we have a plant, we have the first eating organism, and the second eating organism. This could go on and on. A second example here is the sun, the plant, which is the phytoplankton, which is algae, the zooplankton, which is a small organism that lives in the water, the shrimp that eat the zooplankton, and then Miss G, who ate the shrimp. Now, notice I didn't start with myself. When we make a food chain, we want to start with the sun and show it going the correct way. So our arrows are always going to be pointing to the right. Okay, and that looks strange. Let's get rid of that. The reason I want to do that with the arrow specifically, I'm making a point to show you that the arrow is, what is happening here? Sorry. The arrow is specifically pointing to the right because we point the arrow in the direction of energy, right? The only reason I ate that shrimp to begin with is because I needed some energy. My body needs energy when I get hungry. It needs energy to be able to blink my eyes. I need energy to be able to stand up. I need energy to be able to talk to you right now. The whole reason I eat is to get nutrients into my body. Okay, so I'm getting nutrients from the shrimp. The shrimp got nutrients from the zooplankton. The zooplankton got nutrients from the phytoplankton. And the phytoplankton was able to make its own nutrients from the sun. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So the arrow is always going to point to who's getting the nutrients. This does not mean that the sun is eating the phytoplankton. I want to make sure we're getting that. It means that the sun is passing along the energy. So all energy starts with the sun. So I'm going to make a couple more copies of this so that you can see. So plankton, shrimp to Miss G. Okay. So these are the very basic foundations of making a food chain. Hopefully I'm not confusing you too much with my lack of vocabulary here. I'm just trying to make it as simple as possible to start out with, and then we can start beefing up these ideas as we go throughout the lesson. So again, food chains are a series of organisms, each dependent on the next as a food source. So I'm dependent on the shrimp. The shrimp is dependent on the zooplankton. The zooplankton is dependent on the phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton was dependent on the sun. Okay, either way, the sun is transferring its energy. The phytoplankton is transferring its energy. The zooplankton is transferring its energy. The shrimp is transferring its energy then to me. Okay, so the arrow represents a transfer of energy. I will write that here just in case. So the arrow represents the transfer of energy, not who eats who. Okay, so it's important that the order of the organisms is correct. That way you're not getting confused as to who's eating what. Okay? All right. Here we go. So let's talk about who are the different players. We know what the sun is. The sun is the light that we utilize, but the sun plays a huge role in food chains. Okay, none of this is possible without the sun, and we're going to talk about why. First, I'd like to point out before we even move that the sun is abiotic. Abiotic. And that's important because it's a non-living thing. A non-living thing is supplying our entire food chain with the energy that we need. Okay, that's super important to understand. The sun is not living, but it's supplying. Without it, this food chain cannot occur. So with that knowledge, let's move on to the next slide. So here I have a picture of a plant, cute little plant here. Okay, we all know this process, or should at least know the name photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is where a plant uses energy from the sun to make its own food. I've already talked about this in class. We'll talk about it again. But we said that plants love carbon dioxide. They take it in, obviously not breathing like us, but just for effect, right? They take in carbon dioxide. And we said that the plants love the little carbon molecules, but they don't like the oxygen. So they chop it up, they keep the carbon, and they release the oxygen. We get the oxygen, the cycle continues, okay? But the carbon is used to make this chain, and it'll look like this. So we start off with carbon, or actually, let me find a picture real quick on the internet. You guys can follow along with me. Carbon dioxide. Find a good picture. Okay, like this. Copy image. This is how I make these slides for you guys. Okay, so we have this image of carbon dioxide. What happens when it enters, here, let me get this too, over here. Bam. Okay, so when this little plant takes in the carbon dioxide, this molecule, in black we have carbon, and the two red circles represent oxygen, okay? And so what happens when the plant gets this molecule is it takes, let's see, let's do a line. It chops off the oxygen, just chops them off. Let's make a copy of that. Chops it off. Hiya. Just kidding, that doesn't look right at all. Let's chop it off. There we go. Oxygen, the two red circles here are going to leave, and you're going to have a bunch of these black circles left, which is carbon. So what they do then, this little plant inside is going to put all the carbons together like a little train. Okay, and what happens here, this is a carbohydrate. Really, all that means is that it's sugar or food for the plant. So the plant doesn't need to eat anything. All it needs is light energy, energy from the sun, to be able to break apart. So carbon dioxide comes in, it uses the light energy to chop and chop, get rid of the oxygen that leaves out here, and the carbons, they put those together. So they're going to have a bunch of carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Put them together. Let's make it 6 so that it's glucose. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. Okay, this would be considered a carbon chain or a sugar. That's what the plant gets to eat. That's how the plant grows. So the plant doesn't need to grab another plant and tear it apart. It doesn't eat other things. It uses energy from the sun to break apart the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. I breathe out carbon dioxide. The plant takes it. It says, yes, I get to make my food today. It's the ingredients for my food. Using the energy from the sun, it chops off oxygen. It chops off the other oxygen, gets rid of it so that we can breathe, keeps this carbon, puts all of them together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Once it has a sugar molecule, also known as glucose, that is food for the plant. The plant uses it to grow and move forward. Now, since the plant is making its own food, we call this, or any plant, a producer. This is a key term you must know. Okay? Plants are producers. They produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis. I just went over what that is. Okay? Photosynthesis, where a plant takes light energy, uses it to chop apart carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, keeps the carbon, makes a chain. Once it's formed sugar, it uses it to grow. That is a producer. Feel free to pause the video as you need, go back, whatever. Totally good. Now, let's go back to our food chain. Okay, so we have this picture here. We have the sun. We already know it produces light energy, so let's add that in. Light energy, right there. Sorry, just trying to format this correctly. Light energy. Now, the phytoplankton, remember, is a type of algae. It's a type of plant. So if I were to label the phytoplankton and or the corn, I would say that they are producers. Producers. Okay, they make their own food. Phytoplankton grow because they make their own food. Corn grows because it's a plant and it makes its own food. All right, now, not everything can make their own food. So we also have what's known as consumers. Okay, so consumers are animals or just regular or any type of organism that eats a producer, plants, or it can eat other consumers. For example, in our diagram here, a cow cannot make its own food, and so it eats the corn. Therefore, a cow is a consumer. It consumes food. Same with people. People eat the cow. Okay, so people are consumers as well. Now, do cows eat people? No. So there's a difference between these two, and that's what we're about to kind of distinguish. So let's go over here. So, consumers, there's different types of consumers. There's herbivores. If you think of the word herb, that'll kind of give a hint as to what they eat. For example, herbivores only eat plants. We also have carnivores. If you speak Spanish, you know carne means meat. So carnivore means an organism that eats meat. Omnivores. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. And decomposers, also known as detrivores, they eat dead material, so things that die. I have all of this right now. Right now, all I want you to do is get an overall view. There are producers that can make their own food. And then there are consumers. They cannot make their own food. They have to eat other things. So they can eat plants, producers, or they can eat other consumers. So the way that we talk about them, we give them each a different type of name. Okay, moving forward. Here are the definitions for each. So an herbivore, like I said, the root word herb, meaning, herbs are plants. Therefore, herbivores are organisms that only eat plants. An example of this would be like a koala bear. Second, here we have carnivores. Carnivores are organisms that only eat animals. Again, eating meat. So a lion would be an example of a carnivore. Okay, herbivores are like vegetarians. Carnivores are definitely the opposite of that. Now, omnivores, like I said, eat both plants and animals. An example of this would be the bear. Bears eat fish, but they also eat berries and honey, nuts and fruits. And finally, we have decomposers. Let's move this out of the way completely. Decomposers are organisms that eat dead organic matter. Okay, an example that we have here, oops, would be worms, mushrooms, insects, bacteria. These organisms are going to be eating all the nasty stuff. This is why when you put someone in a grave, then later on they're only going to be their skeleton because decomposers eat the flesh. Or if you see a dead animal on the side of the road, as time goes on, it slowly decomposes or is eaten by these small insects, bacterias, worms, you name it. Okay, moving forward. So we're going to beef up um, our food chain here. So a cow and the zooplankton both are organisms that don't necessarily eat other organisms, but they do eat plants. Okay, so a cow and a zooplankton are both examples of herbivores because they only eat plants. So I'm just going to label here that they are the herbivores. Okay, now shrimp and people, or me, the shrimp, other people, we're all either eating both plants and animals, or we eat just other animals. We could be considered either of the two that we just talked about. We can either be considered carnivores or omnivores. For the sake of time, I'm just going to label for the sake of time, I'm just going to label all three of us omnivores or carnivores. Okay, so totally up to you. Doesn't matter what you would like to do. But just know that you'll need to, in the future, when you make a food chain, um, decide what the organism is. Okay, so to complicate things even further, when it gets to me, Miss G, when I've finished eating my shrimp dinner or lunch, um, let's say we look into the future many years, and let's say I die. What happens when I die? Well, we've already talked about it. My body will be decomposed. What happens after that? Well, here's a food chain that we can start out with here now, to look at that. Okay, because I don't want to talk about me dying. Let's talk about something else dying. Okay, so one thing in this food chain, this is an example of a really nicely done food chain, is that we're going to add decomposers into the food chain. And what's specifically important about this picture is here, this area down here. It's going to go blank for a minute. Just give me a second. Okay, this area down here is super important. And so we'll focus on that in a second. But there's something wrong with this food chain, and it doesn't start with the sun. So I'm going to write that in just so we're clear. Again, every food chain has to start with the sun. Please make sure. I put these types of trick questions on quizzes every year, and every year kids get super confused, and they're like, "What's missing from this food chain? It looks perfect." Um, and and it's usually that the sun is missing. So please do not forget that the sun starts a food chain. So grass is a producer. Okay, grass makes its own food using energy from the sun. So if you want to add in an arrow as well from the sun to the grass, you can do that too. Let's make it orange. Okay, so the sun's light energy is giving this plant energy to go through photosynthesis. When this plant goes through photosynthesis, it makes its own food. It can grow and carry on life's processes because it is using energy from the sun. Now, what eats the grass is a grasshopper. And notice that we've titled it a consumer, but it says primary consumer. So this is where things might get a little tricky. I'm going to make a new slide here. And hopefully this works out. Okay. So the word primary, I'm going to make this bigger. Primary means first. Primary means first. Secondary means second. Tertiary means third. We won't really go past that. Sometimes we'll see apex predator. We'll figure out later on in another lesson why that makes so much sense to say that. But all that means is top predator, strongest in the food chain, or the one that's going to be the top predator in the food chain. Okay, so those are some key terms that just are kind of common knowledge to have at this point. Okay, so when it says primary consumer, it means first to eat from the producers. The bluebird that eats the grasshopper is the secondary consumer, the second to eat. The snake that eats the bluebird is the tertiary consumer, the third to eat. And the owl is the apex predator, which eats the snake. Okay. And again, notice the direction of the arrows. There is a transfer of energy to the grasshopper. There is a transfer of energy to the bluebird. There is a transfer of energy to the snake. And there is a transfer of energy to the owl. Through the food chain, we are transferring energy. That is the whole point of eating. Now, again, I could go through and in class, I might have you guys label these herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, but that's not my main focus today. Right now, I just want to focus on what happens after that apex predator dies or anything dies in a food chain. So the owl dies, let's pretend, for whatever reason, it got a disease maybe. It dies, it falls to the ground, and there are some mushrooms nearby. The mushrooms don't necessarily crawl over and start to eat the owl, the dead owl, but it definitely is able to kind of source nutrients from the owl as it starts to decompose. And what happens, maybe a better example would be a worm here. This could be worms or mushrooms. But what happens is as the body is decomposed, it's kind of like the worm or the mushroom is eating. It's eating from the dead organism. And what I can't ask you guys this in person right now, but what happens when you get full? The short answer is you have to use the restroom. You had to go poop, right? And so when an organism or when a decomposer gets full, it poops out any nutrients from that dead matter. And they do this on purpose. They don't actually absorb all the nutrients into their body. Leftover nutrients is pooped out. Where are these decomposers? They're in the grass, right? So these decomposers are going to release nutrients into the grass, and the grass will use not only the sun's energy, but nutrients from the soil, from the decomposers, to start the whole thing again. This is the literal circle of life. Okay, it doesn't talk about this in The Lion King, but it just talks about, oh, poor little guy died. Doesn't talk about the nutrients from that dead organic matter or that dead organism is going back into the food chain. Okay, this is why you can't have cemeteries too close to farms, because I mean, you can come to the conclusion of what that means. But yeah, so this is the literal circle of life. This is not what you're normally taught, but this is the circle of life that is true scientific fact. Okay? Um so anyways, yeah. Um, so adding this last piece into the food chain, we start with the producer. We have our primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and apex predator. Again, this can go longer, this could be shorter. This is kind of just the main format for making a food chain. And then notice we end it with a decomposer eating that dead organic matter, pooping out all of the extra nutrients that producer is then going to be able to use along with sunlight to start the chain over again. Um, yeah. So, why does it matter? Why are we learning about food chains? Well, the more we learn about who eats what and how transfers energy is transferred throughout an ecosystem, right? Because they all live together in one area. They're all dividing up resources and sharing space and all the things that we've learned about in the past couple of weeks. They're all coexisting together. If we were to get rid of any of these, we'd be able to figure out the chain reaction of how it would affect and shape our ecosystem. So, not today, but in a couple of weeks, we'll start to look at food webs. And a food web is just where it's just multiple food chains put together. We'll have an official day where we're working on food webs. We don't necessarily need to get too into it right now. But when you draw a food web, you're just putting together a bunch of food chains because some food chains might be interlinked. So let's start down here with grass, grains, and carrots. These are our producers. And again, we don't have the sun, but let's add it in. Let me copy this over here. Copy. And let's add it in here. Where'd you go? There we go. Okay. So the sun is here now. It is giving nutrients to the carrots. It's giving light energy to the carrots, light energy to the grass, and light energy to the grain. If I follow, let's say, the grain is eaten by mice. The mice are eaten by owls. That's one food chain. I could go back. Grains are also eaten by grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are eaten by owls. That's a second food chain. Third food chain. Grains are eaten by birds. End of food chain. Sorry, not end of food chain. Grains are eaten by birds. Birds are eaten by foxes. Okay, that's a fourth food chain. And so on and so forth, right? Carrots are eaten by rabbits. Rabbits eaten by foxes. Grass eaten by rabbits. Rabbits eaten by foxes. 2. Grasses eaten by grasshoppers. Grasshoppers eaten by owls. Now, notice just right here in, not that. In the very center, we have grasshoppers. I don't know what shape. That was weird. Hold on one second. Let's try that one more time. Right here with grasshoppers. Transparent, line, orange. Okay, with grasshoppers here. Let's say grasshoppers are a main source of food for owls and birds. Okay, if for some reason we get rid of the grains or grasses, grasshoppers are gonna miss out on a food source. They're not going to be able to eat, and their population might start to decrease. If their population starts to decrease, owls still have mice to eat, so they might be okay. But birds, they eat the grasshoppers and they also eat the grains, so they might lose some food. I think they might be okay because they have grains, but they also need that protein from the grasshoppers. So if anything happens down here to the producers, there's a chain effect all the way up to the secondary and tertiary consumers. So putting together food webs helps us to see, hey, there's some key animals here that are keeping together this entire ecosystem. As small as grasshoppers might be, they're a food source for multiple different types of birds. This might be a problem if their population declines. Okay, so that's the importance of a food web. It's just to be able to see the different eating dynamics within an ecosystem. Now, this is called a trophic level pyramid. Again, just like with food webs, we will have an entire lesson dedicated to this later on, not necessarily now, but it's an important concept for us to understand. So this is a trophic level pyramid. Trophic, the word trophic just means energy. So energy pyramid, I'm going to write that in though for you. Why is this not working? Trophic means energy. There we go. Okay, so this is an energy level pyramid. Remember that just like in a food chain, energy is transferred from the sun to the producer, from the producer to the primary consumer, and so on and so forth. The arrow points in the way that the energy is transferred. Grass transferring energy to the grasshopper as it's being eaten, so on and so forth. If we put this picture into a pyramid, we would see that producers are always, always, always at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, notice that the pyramid is wider at the base of the pyramid. Does that wait? Okay, the base of the pyramid is very wide as compared to the top, right? Very small. As you can see in this picture, as we move up the energy pyramid, we lose energy. So plants or producers, again, this is lining up the same way, plants have the most energy. They have made all the energy that they will need. They transfer the most energy. Okay, so producers always have the most energy. As we move up, we have herbivores, omnivores, primary and secondary consumers, all in this middle area. Okay, herbivores here match up with the primary consumers or the bunnies, for example. Okay, they have less energy than the plants, obviously because the plants used some energy to grow and sprout their fruits or vegetables, whatever the case may be. Okay. Then the snakes eat the rabbits. They're considered predators, the purple area, or maybe even the secondary consumers, and they're getting even less energy. And finally, we have the tertiary consumers, or the top predators, that get the least amount of energy out of anybody because of where they are in the food chain. Now, that brings us to top predators. I just want to bring back a vocab term over here, which is apex predator. Apex predator means the top. When we say the top of a pyramid, we are saying the apex of a pyramid. That's where the term comes in. So this is the apex predator position. Apex predators. Okay. That'll make more sense later on, but there's that, just in case you care. That's why we call it the apex predator, because usually they're at the top of energy pyramids. So again, plants are always going to have the most energy. Then the herbivores or primary consumers, the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers or the apex predators. Now, why do we lose energy as we move upwards? Well, frankly, right? The bunny eats the plant, it starts running around. That's losing energy. It starts hopping around. even more energy lost. It starts digesting its food, even more energy lost, right? So as you go, all the energy that the bunny got from the plant originally, yeah, it might have gotten a lot, but you're not getting, the snake's not getting all the energy that the bunny originally got, because the bunny was jumping around and wasting some of the energy that it took in. Then the snake's going to do stuff where it's going to lose energy. And by the time the apex predator gets there, it's lost a lot of its original energy that the producer produced in the first place. So, looking at this, I'm going to pose a question to you. I'm not going to answer it right now, but I'm going to ask you in class. Um, is it smart for apex predators to eat producers, or well, okay, let's say it like this. If you want to get the most energy from what you're eating, should an apex predator eat secondary consumers or producers? In which case are they going to get the most energy? Eating plants or predators? I'll pose that out there and I'll ask you in class to answer that for me. Okay, so clearly all of these organisms have a relationship, right? A predator-prey relationship, if you will. But either way, they all depend on each other for food. Okay. And so, again, just like I said earlier, when we look at a food web and we put all these different food chains together, we can see which organisms are really key in keeping this whole thing running. For organisms like that, we call them ketone species. We have one more slide before we're done. I know we've been going for kind of a while, but ketone species are organisms that play a vital role in maintaining the structure, stability, and diversity of an ecosystem. Ketone species are species that play a role in maintaining the structure, stability, and diversity in an ecosystem. They keep everything together. A perfect picture here is this picture of an archway. The ketone species is represented by this red keystone here. If we were to get rid of the keystone, we see that all the blocks fall apart. So in this picture, let's break it down. We have sharks, we have the stingrays, and we have crabs, shrimp, sea anemones, mussels, all here. Okay, they live in different parts of the ocean, right? The sharks are going to live up higher and so forth. Okay, now sharks eat stingrays. Stingrays eat the small crustaceans at the bottom. If we were to get rid of sharks, meaning humans fishing them, they die of diseases, whatever the case may be, if we got rid of these sharks, they would no longer be controlling the population of stingrays. There's no sharks controlling this population. They're going to keep reproducing, and their population is going to get out of control. It's going to be overpopulation of stingrays. If nothing's controlling that population, they're just going to eat to their heart's content. What do stingrays eat? They eat these little crabs and shrimp and mussels and sea anemones. Luckily, sea anemones sting, so they're probably not going to go after those. They're probably going to be able to survive. But the crabs and the shrimp and the mussels have no other defense mechanisms. The only reason why they survive in general is because the sharks are eating the stingrays and keeping them at a minimum so that they don't eat everything. But without the sharks, those stingrays are able to eat the crabs and the shrimp and the mussels, therefore wiping them out, possibly driving them to extinction. But notice how with the ketone species, the shark, everything is in balance. The structure, stability, and diversity. Diversity means we have a number of different types of organisms living here. Here, we get rid of the shark, all of a sudden, diversity goes down, meaning we have sea anemones and we have um, the the stingrays. The entire ecosystem's structure and stability and diversity collapses in this case. So even though we might not like sharks, they are controlling the stingray population so that we can have more diversity. So in the end, the sharks being there is really important. That is a ketone species. Now, in class, we're going to be learning about wolves, like I told you in the beginning of this lecture. Those wolves are going to, we're just going to be having a case study on wolves, and we'll see how they are or are not ketone species in that area. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.